the banks and the industries and so on. And Obama just continues the same process and tells the people at the same time that we will go back to the free market again and so on. That is civil society. That is the bourgeois character. He has a strange type of mentality. So what then Plato did was to, and what he does too, Thomas More, is to he takes a sophist, Socrates, and transforms him into a citizen who participates in the wars and is drunk all night long, and then in the morning he goes to the battlefield, but he is still able to fight in spite of the fact that he drank beer all night long. He also, after drinking beer all night long, has suddenly high-level discourses and so on. So he shows on one side he's a drunkard, he's a bourgeois, on the other side he is also a citizen, and so that's what he wanted to do with the whole civil society, to transform it into the state and the bourgeois into a citizen. We become citizens every 4 years when we vote, and then we fall back into the bourgeois state again and don't care about the common good and just think about the private good and private profit and so on and so on. And Obama said recently that if somebody drops out of high school or whatever, then he commits a crime against himself, but he also commits a crime against the nation. Then another principle comes up. That means that there is something else to care about, not only your private thing. Or when Kennedy said, don't ask what your state can do for you, but what you can do for the state, and so on, are attempts to overcome the bourgeois and to make him into a citizen. That's what they did in the Soviet Union. They killed the bastards, and that has something to do with this cruelty. But whoever says, you should not do that, and I would certainly be one who would say that, then you have to recommend another means how one overcomes this narcissistic creep who has no sense for solidarity and so on. That will be Obama's problem. He either will overcome these creeps, or these creeps will overcome him, and that will be a beastly struggle. And it depends how much, if the nation stays with him, or not, will be very, very important for the next month and the next years. Okay, so nevertheless, the Thomas More solves that problem by and against his own English experience and so on in a Platonic way. That means he subordinates civil society totally under the state. That means the individual becomes, like with Hegel too, the individual becomes an individual only through socialization. The more you socialize, the more you become yourself too. The less you are socialized, the less your own inner being develops. That means it is only through solidarity that we reach autonomy and full development. Only by going out to the other and returning from the other to ourselves are we able to become real human beings. To the extent to which we do not develop solidarity, and that's why we have no health insurance with 48 million people, because our solidarity is spontaneous. If there is a catastrophe, we do become spontaneous, spontaneously solidary. So when I went to the highway and there was this accident, there were a lot of people helping. The fire engine people, the ambulance people. There were one car was laying there, the other car was laying there, and people caringly went to these people who were hit and so on. So in an accident we become solidary, but it is not a virtue which we would have all the time, and that is the reason why since 1912 we discuss health insurance, and even today we cannot get it together and so on. So we will have to have it now, but only because of an objective trend, because there are $1,200 maybe on each car because of health costs and so on. Therefore, the capitalistic ruling class will now say we have to have it, and when they give the okay, then Obama can or Clinton can get it. But already Obama has not promised health insurance for all of them. Now, why in God's name not all of them? When Bismarck did it, it was 100% in 1870. See, even Obama now, with Roosevelt's liberalism, cannot make it all the way. Already in his promises, you know. He will have to ensure all of them, and not only a few, and so nevertheless, this is very important. Then on the magistrates. Now, More lived in England, in which the king had already been killed. That means by the Puritans, he had been hanged, and so therefore the king whom he had was a constitutional king. And so 200 years later, you know, we fought against George, and we called that a revolution and so on. But it was no revolution. Revolution means that you overthrow another class. And, but the nobility was already emasculated. The king was already constitutional king, who was only a decoration on the head of the government. The parliament really ruled, and not the king, and so on. So, and the parliament was to a large extent bourgeois, the same like the bourgeois in Boston. So that means bourgeois fought against bourgeois. You cannot make a revolution like this. You cannot make a revolution against your own class. You can only make a revolution against another class. And that happened, as we said, in the Civil War, when the Yankees up there in the north, the capitalistic ruling class, butchered the southern ruling class, and they're still weeping today about this whole thing. But it was obviously a progressive type of a measure, because slavery was a regression really into heaven knows where. That was historically long overcome, and suddenly it came up here, and religion had something to do with it, because Las Casas, the Dominican monk, went to the Indian Council of Charles V and made the recommendation that the Indians were to the Indians, an idiotic name, the Native Americans, and that's an idiotic name too, because the guy didn't know where he was. So nevertheless, he told them that these so-called Indians would die under slavery, digging gold and so on. And then comes this addition to it, that one should have other types of slaves, and one should bring the blacks because they had bigger bones and they would survive the whole torture and so on. And so it happened that we got the slavery here, but that was obsolete when it even started, and so that was a real revolution. So now these islanders there, they are a republic. There's no king at all. They have a president and they have a senate. They look a little bit like us in a certain sense, or you could say maybe Thomas. Well, Thomas couldn't have anything in mind yet at that time. So, so nevertheless, the magistrate is a republican type of a thing, and the president is voted in, and every city, state has its own president, and so on. Then number 4 is on the occupations of the utopians. And I said already that the fundamental occupation of all of them is farmers, and then they become something, added something to it. The working hours are limited. The idea is that everybody can be fed by reducing the working hours. But that means also that everybody has to work. That means there is not a group on the bottom, as we have it here, bottom who doesn't work, and then there is the ruling class which doesn't work. So everybody, the people down and the people on top, they all have to work. And that is why it is possible, with relatively fewer labor hours, nevertheless, to feed the whole and give a fine normal life to all of everybody's fed, clothed, and housed, and so on, with this amount of working hours. And then on their lives together, and there are many different customs, and Thomas doesn't hold on to these titles there very well. Things flow very nicely, beautiful humanistic type of a language, and so, but he treats, you know, all kinds of themes which belong really in another chapter, appear in another chapter, and so on. So, and it's lively. It's not systematized. It's not dry stuff, catechism or whatever, but it's really a living, flowing, wonderful type of a writing. And then there is another chapter on the travels of the utopians. There are very friendly relationships, of course, between those cities and so on. Then on slaves. Now, maybe we can look into this. On slaves is not really on slaves. That's very funny. On slaves, the slaves are people who have not been sentenced to death, which is nice. That means they have been allowed to live, and therefore, and instead of that, have been made into slaves. And that slavery is very harsh and very terrible. So there is another chapter which is on war. And so these are things which we really would like not to see in a utopia. You know, slavery is a class thing, so there are slaves and there are non-slaves and so on. We would rather say that he would have talked about a class of society, but he is realistic, and maybe Plato was a warning to him, because you know that Plato wrote one book on the state and another one on laws. That means he thought first that people could get along without laws. Now, Thomas wants to have very few laws, but nevertheless he wants to have some. So Thomas stands between Plato's state and Plato's book on the laws. So he knows that people cannot live entirely without laws. That means they cannot simply follow their own intention, their own virtue and so on. They do need some outside control, but as little as possible. So he doesn't go so far and to develop a whole law code like we have it in the laws then. But Plato was terribly disappointed, particularly after he went to Syracuse and the tyrant almost put him into slavery. Plato traveled from city-state to city-state in order to introduce his idea of the state, and after this experience that the tyrant of Syracuse in Sicily wanted to sell him into slavery, that made him really sober, and he started to think differently. And so I think that experience is present also in Thomas there. So, and here we have these things, also something funny there, a little bit funny, I think, and that is, moreover, in choosing partners, so he goes into, when you want to have a marriage partner, he goes in all kinds of details there. Now, we saw Thomas himself was married, first wife from whom he had all the children, and then 3 months later he married another woman, and that's the woman who is in the movie there. I mean, it's played in the movie. And she was very down to earth and very prosaic in a certain sense. She was older than he was. He just needed somebody to take care of the house there. But we saw some friendly relationship when she became jealous of Margaret or so. Then he went over and consoled her and so on. So it was, what is it called nowadays, the marriage of convenience or of necessity or whatever. So, but it was not a bad relationship, I think. Nevertheless, he has experience there. He wanted to become a clergyman. He lived in the court of a cardinal for a long time, but then he decided for a secular type of a thing, and this is very good for us because he somehow tries to mediate between the religious and the secular, which is one of these horrible contradictions in civil society. So, nevertheless, I want to read this there. First of all, the euthanasia thing, that we get a little bit, those of you who don't have it, euthanasia thing first. As I have said, they treat the sick with great kindness and leave nothing undone to restore their health, whether it is by drugs or by dieting. Now that sounds very modern. If anyone is suffering from an incurable disease, they console him by sitting with him, talking to him, and supplying all the comforts they can. But if a disease is not merely beyond treatment, but also a constant source of pain and agony, the priests and magistrates remind him that he is not up to all the tasks of life, is troublesome to others and a burden to himself, and is now outliving his own death. We would say this today, the quality of life is so low that it makes no sense anymore. And again, I'm called for consulting here to our Catholic hospital there, where people want to commit suicide and are afraid of hell, and what are we doing then in order to, which way to go. Then they advise him not to resolve to feed, that pestilence and sickness any longer, nor to hesitate to die, since life is a torment to him. They bid him to take good hope and release himself from that bitter life, as if from a prison or torture rack, or at least give his permission for others to remove him. Now, here we have Dr. Quarkin almost, where the patient gives permission to Dr. Quarkin, his little machine there, to remove him from life. They tell him that since he is going to put an end to, not to pleasure, but to punishment, and pleasure is a very important thing, happiness is very important for the Utopia. So that means this bifurcation between redemption and happiness is one of those antagonisms which are to be resolved. When we went to the monks in Three Rivers, they emphasize redemption and exclude all what we would call happiness. Happiness connected with marriage, happiness connected with having something, happiness connected with power, which one, if one has some. So they say no to all of this by their vows. So they, and then Walter Benjamin has this beautiful formula that sometimes in nature you have opposite energies which go in opposite direction and at the same time support each other. That means redemption and happiness go into different directions, but if you strive for happiness, you can also somehow produce or help the quiet approach of the kingdom of God at the same time. That means that the purpose of politics is not to establish the kingdom of God, but the purpose of politics is to make people happier, which brings us, to the Obama decision, which is a political decision, which is a secular decision. It is supposed to take care of different illnesses which we have, and hopefully these embryo cells will help there. So it's happiness, it's not the kingdom of God. But the question is, if not this striving for happiness, which is always transitory, which is the rhythm of nature, and as such transitory, no matter if a marriage lasts 5 years or 22 years, it will always be too short if it is a happy marriage. And on the other hand, that while we are striving politically toward this happy condition, that we also promote at the same time the silent approach of the opposite, namely redemption and the kingdom. They tell him that since he is going to put an end not to pleasure but to punishment, he would be well advised to do it. And since in that matter he is going to take the advice of priests, the interpreters of God, his action will also be pious and holy. So there is nothing wrong with, under these conditions, with assisted suicide, for which we just have punished Dr. Quarkian with, 5 years of prison or something like that. Those who are persuaded by this either end their own lives by abstinence from food, or else are released from it while they are asleep without any sensation of death. But they, by the way, when I went up to Canada, one reason was the 30th anniversary of the death of my wife. And so we went to the hospital, we took pictures of different places where we lived, and the university where I taught, the Western Ontario University. But I also went to the emergency place where we brought my wife, and when we came, she was already dying, and I practically forced the doctor to make her alive again, which he did. And she lived the whole day long up to 2 o'clock at night when she died, and the whole family was there and so on. But one question is if one should do this, of course. Or when one knows that cancer is in the lungs and the colon and it is terminal and so on, if one should still, but one always has this hope that maybe, it would turn and so one does things which may be wrong things, because by awakening her again, she was fully awake again, for another 12 hours or so, but one, in a certain sense, one promotes or prolongs the agony and so on. So you see that the text here is quite prudent, but if you add the emotions to it, then he has he has his emotions quite restrained, like a lawyer usually does, and a judge, and so on. You must not forget, that he sentenced also heretics of the Wycliffe persuasion to death by burning alive, and so on. So we also, when we talk about saints, the saints are not necessarily saints because of their own accomplishments, but because of grace, as Christians would say. That means because they are accepted by God in spite of the fact that some aspects were unacceptable. And what was unacceptable by the Roman Catholic Church, namely that he married too early, was maybe not the real measure, but maybe what made him less acceptable was that he killed these co-Christians, and we don't know the number of them. Without any sensation of death, well, that may also be a slight euphemism and so on, but they never remove anyone against his will. That is important now. Now, Dr. Quarkin did that neither, but I think he was sentenced because of one case where this was not entirely clear if the will was there. Nor are they any the less considerate to him. It is considered honorable to yield to persuasion and die like this. But they think a man unworthy of burial or cremation who commits suicide without having a reason approved of by the priests and the Senate. So church and state do play an important role in this whole issue. Instead, in great disgrace, he is flung unburied into some bog. So of course, suicide cases up to recently were not buried in holy ground. And then there was a transition period in which the church thought that suicide will always be a result of insanity, and then began to bury suicide cases. But then, in the meantime, they have found out that people may commit suicide after quite rational discourse with themselves and other people. Okay, so here, so that is one case. I just want to give you that in order to get in touch, with his language and with his mentality and with his character. The woman does not, now we get to the marriage thing, a woman does not marry before she is 18 years old. So that may have been also the law in England, and maybe that's not an innovation. And a man not until he is 4 years older than that. So the man has to be 22 years old before he gets married. If a man or woman is found guilty of secret lust before marriage, that means they live together before they are married, the offender is severely punished and both are forbidden to marry forever. Unless the president pardons them and forgives their offense. So there is always a way out, hopefully. But also the head of the household and his wife in whose home the shameful act was committed are held in great disgrace on the grounds that they were remiss in their duty as parents or whatever. The reason for the severe punishment of this crime is the realization that very few people would join in married love in which they saw they had to spend all their lives with one person and endure all the consequent inconvenience, he really was married, if they were not carefully restrained from random sexual relations. Now you have a good argument here. Thomas there, he's a man of experience. Okay, now something, when you choose now how you get into the whole marriage business there, and moreover, in choosing partners, now it comes, how you choose your partner. And he knows about that too now. And moreover, in choosing partners, they seriously and rigidly observe a ritual that to us, that means he in England, seemed quite absurd and ridiculous. A respectable and honored matron shows the woman, whether she is a maiden or widow, to her suitor in complete nakedness. And in turn, some trustworthy man shows the suitor naked to the girl. When we were laughing at this custom as being a silly one, and were finding fault with it, the Utopians expressed their surprise at the amazing stupidity of all other nations. For they said, in a matter involving a trifling sum of money, like buying a horse, other people are so careful that they refuse to buy the horse, however uncovered he may be, if the saddle and harness are not taken off, in case there is a sore hidden under those coverings. But in choosing a wife, a matter which will bring pleasure or revulsion for the rest of one's life, they are so careless that while the rest of her body is concealed by clothes, they judge the whole woman from a space of a few inches, for only her face is visible, and then marry her, not without a great danger of a bad match, if anything offends their taste afterwards. For not all men are wise enough to regard character only, and in the marriages of such wise men, bodily endowments make a useful addition to the spiritual virtues. And he's quite a realistic fellow. Natural, long before Freud, naturally so foul a deformity can lie concealed under those clothes that it can quite alienate the mind from one's wife when it is no longer possible he be bodily separated from her. If such a deformity should happen to come about after marriage, then each man must bear his lot. No divorce. But there ought to be legal provision to prevent anyone from being caught by such guile before marriage. The Utopians had to be all the more cautious on this, as they are the only people in that world who are content with one wife, and marriage is not often dissolved for them except by death, unless the reason is adultery or some unendurable fault of character. That's the New Testament, of course. If either husband or wife is afflicted in this way, the Senate gives permission to him or her to find another partner. The other partner forever lives a single life in disgrace. But they in no way tolerate a man to divorce his wife if she is blameless, just because some physical misfortune strikes her. For they think it cruel to abandon anyone in his hour of greater need, and believe that it will also breed great distrust in old age, which both brings sickness and is a sickness itself. But it sometimes happens that the characters of husband and wife are quite irreconcilable, and they both discover others with whom they hope they can live more pleasantly. So they separate by mutual consent and contract new marriages. But this cannot be done without the permission of the Senate, which allows divorces only after its members and their wives have carefully examined the case. It is not easy even then, as they know that a ready hope of new marriage is most disadvantageous for strengthening the love of husband and wife. Adulterers are punished with the severest slavery. So here you have slavery is a form of punishment which everybody can happen to everybody. If both offenders were married, the injured parties, if they wish, may gain a divorce and marry each other. Otherwise, they may marry anyone they want. But if the injured party remains in love with so ill-deserving a partner, he is not forbidden to enjoy his right of marriage, as long as he is willing to follow the convicted partners in his hard labor. Like we have in the Soviet Union, where sometimes people went to Siberia with their partners. It sometimes happens that the repentance of the one and the constant kindness of the other move the president to compassion and gain them freedom once more. But if such a person falls back into his original ways, he is put to death. And that is another problem. Utopia is not entirely against the death penalty, but there is a mitigation at least. Slavery is one way out by which one can prevent the worst death penalty. But the death penalty is still there as a possibility. So the question is, if we, let's see, Catholic or Protestant morality have not evolved in some ways beyond the utopia. and particularly as far as the death penalty is concerned, as far as slavery is concerned. But the Catholic Church found slavery morally acceptable up to the Second Vatican Council, and the same way also torture up into the 19th century, and usually was mitigated in the 18th century. So Thomas, lives before all of this, and therefore, he sees the evolution of morality, at least to some extent. On warfare, that would be number 8 there. That, of course, is realistic enough that wars cannot be prevented entirely. But the Republic, this Utopian Republic, engages in war, first of all, more for others than for itself. So if they find another nation oppressed, they are very willing to help them before they themselves would go into war for their own sake. Also, they prefer mercenaries. That means they hire people who do not do anything else than fighting, like that Blackwater there, so all these mercenary groups which we have in Iraq. So only in an extreme case do they engage their own people, their own citizens, become soldiers. So while war is not abolished completely, it is somewhat mitigated. So there are attempts to diminish it. There are also rules of engagement about the civilian population. The civilian population must not be touched at all. If a city is besieged, those who counseled in the city that one should surrender are later on treated very well, and so on. There is a certain method to weaken the enemy by assassinating the head of state or lower types of leadership. So he goes quite into detail. Tyrannicide is allowed. That was a medieval law, which, as we mentioned, Sirico here applied in the case of Chavez when he recommended the assassination of Chavez. Also, Bonhoeffer used that when he made the attack. This movie will come out now, right? The Valkyrie, about the assassination. This thing of
Valkyrie.
Valkyrie, yeah, which is about
Von Stauffenberg.
Stauffenberg's, yeah, assassination attempt. So he also went, as you know, from one confession to the other, and he was told by the priests, that this cannot happen as killing, and he's not allowed to do that until he had a confession with a Jesuit priest, and he remembered the natural law position, the right to life, the right to self-defense, also for a state can defend itself, and not only against other states, but also against the tyrant who ruins the state if he is left in power, and so can be removed. And that was then the permission, which Stauffenberg was a Catholic, also Hitler was a Catholic, one Catholic killed the other, so that he thought he was justified now in order to do that. And a young law student killed the head of state of Israel, who invented the idea of exchange of land for peace, and he thought he would ruin Israel. And he
Yigal Amir,
yeah,
the student.
right, yeah, he's still in prison, right? There was no death sentence, I think.
Against Yitzhak Rabin.
Yeah. But there was no death sentence, right? He's still in prison. Yeah. Okay, so that on the warfare thing. So if we look at the development of international law and the Geneva Conventions and so on, then, it's a quite progressive document, the Utopia. It does not, it is too realistic to say, no war at all. As we, I told you this funny story that I found this journal in an airplane in Croatia, and I found an article about my course, and it said there an American professor, Siebert, discussed the Kantian eternal peace in the Hotel Argentina while the Serbs were bombing the hotel. And everybody thought that was very funny. So this idea of Kant, is the same thing. That means it is the eternal peace is something which has to be approached. But if you continually approach something, peace, that means you have war all the time. And so something is the case also in the Utopia. They want to approach, to avoid war, and if that's not possible, to avoid war for their own citizens, and if that's not possible, then you have to bring your own citizens in with great hesitation and so on. So if you compare that with the first 300 years of Christianity, no war at all, no soldiers in the community, nothing. It was St. Augustine who then said that the first 300 years of Christians had all been Manichaeans, who separate between light and darkness and good and evil, and that war was radically evil. That was the teaching of the old church. And then Augustine said, well, it's evil, but sometimes it's necessary. And there you have this.
And wasn't he the Manichaean?
Yeah, for 9 years he was a Manichaean, and then, had a child, which was called Adeodatus, given by God, and it was illegitimate too. He was not married, African woman, and then he released her. She left back to Africa, and she loved him a lot. And then he was supposed to marry a 12-year-old girl, but she wasn't 12 years old yet, according to the law. So the law was not 18 years, but it was 12 years. And so he had to wait for 2 years, so she was only 10 years old. And then he became ill, he had a lung disease, and as a rhetoric professor, he had to sing all the time, like the priests sing in the church sometimes. And he couldn't sing anymore loud enough, and then he had a converted to Catholicism, back to Catholicism. His mother was Catholic, and then it's Monica. We have the whole family here, Monica and St. Augustine and
Ambrose.
Ambrose, yeah. Ambrose was an Arian, he was a Roman. Augustine was an African. Okay, so, and then the last thing is on religion of the Utopians. And so, it's very tolerant, amazingly progressive. All of the different religions have a right, and the state will protect all people and so on. There is Christianity there, and it is preferred somehow as the most progressed. And we talked about this today a little bit, in what Christianity may be superior, for instance, to... I wanted to ask that question to the German professor who came, in the department, but her thing was so narrowly positivistic that or phenomenological, that one could not ask these questions, to what extent, one religion, a newer religion, is superior to the other, and Islam comes 600 years after Christianity, and why, there must be something in Islam which is superior to Christianity. But what I mentioned was, there is something in Christianity which is superior to Judaism and Jews. I mean, we have to get the consensus of Jews, and there are Jews who would consent to this, that Christianity made thematic what was hidden in the covenant teachings, namely this no fear and love and so on. And something like that is present also in Thomas More, but he would not limit. They're polytheistic people too in that state, and they all are protected, and that's a very progressive type of an idea. Okay, so that is all what we, and our question is, if we would delve deeper into the text, then to what extent we have something here on right and left, and we discussed some of that, collective and individual, very different, balance than our society is. As we said, the magistrate has to decide about suicide and about euthanasia and so on, and divorce. And we see, that the state plays a much greater role than civil society, but he tries to strike a balance in that sense that there is a lot of interference of the state into the life, but it's always the consensus of the individual is asked for. Only if he is willing to go into euthanasia and to be killed when he is asleep and so on, then it can be done. Or only if they are willing to get divorced or whatever. then it can be done. So it is the attempt to strike a balance between the universal and the particular, which with us is out of range. That means the antagonism is enormously deep between the state on one side, Uncle Sam, or whatever, an idiotic type of a name for the state, and on the other side, the individual bourgeois, and so on. So, I mean, we see that the state does, I mean, with this, what is the name of this Jew who stole all these 50 billion?
Madoff.
Huh?
Madoff.
Yeah, right, I want to forget him. So, nevertheless, there the state, deeply, they will sentence him for 150 years, I think. So then, of course, the state comes in with power, but this is just a symbolical act, all the gangsters in Wall Street should be hanged, I'm against the death penalty, so, nevertheless.
He has to remind himself.
Well, Thomas would probably make them slaves. That means they would have to work. For the first time in their life, they would have to work. Okay, so that is all. We want to have the rest of our movie there very fast, and then we go over to the and celebrate.
Do you have the film?
Do I have the film? Oh my God, I don't think I have the film.
Huh?
That would be great. I had the film, right?
They exist.
I think I don't have it. Well, then we have to go over right away. I think I forgot it. Is it in here? No, I don't have it with me. Oh, too bad.
Then we go to the.
Yeah. Okay, do we have any questions still? You have to look at it privately now. Yes?
Well, it's a thought, as I listen to you, it seems that this
Yeah.
whole idea of utopia, pretty close to the original,
Yeah.
it's so alive in our culture.
Yeah.
I mean, it lives like a shadow. There may be the capitalism and all, but it just keeps surfacing, and
Yeah.
sometimes more materially.
Right.
I mean, even today on the news, there was an announcement that agriculture in Michigan is the only industry that's grown. It's grown 3% or something.
Right.
Actually, $3 billion,
Yeah.
from 60 billion to 63 billion. And they're inviting people back to the farms, young
Right,
people to
yeah.
come back, to work on farms.
Yeah.
And I could hear in that a kind of an ideal about the agriculture that
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
seemed very present in what you're
Also,
saying.
Dieter Hennecke, who just died, he had a class on Utopia in 2004 or 5 and so on. And it was a wonderful experience for him. I mean, the students themselves did the whole thing, because they looked at different utopias since Thomas, quite a lot have been written. And so it was a course which really carried itself because people were very excited about it, yeah.
The things about alternative health movement, I think that there's a whole lot of utopia in that.
Right, yeah.
And sometimes people are real disdainful, and they call it idealistic utopia.
Right, right, yeah.
But I think that there's an idea about health
Right,
that is
exactly,
very
yeah,
connected
yeah.
to what the way he spoke.
Yeah. I mean, that means that, usually we look at that, what's the case, and we want students, to bind their brain to what is the case and so on. But what is the case, there is a potential, and the potential is breaking through here and there. In many of the speeches of Obama, there are elements like this.
But it might be against the utopian ideas for it to become too regulated too. Maybe
Yeah.
it has to live almost on
Yeah.
a level
right.
that
Yeah.
isn't always so tangible.
Yeah, right. It's more a longing, right?
Yeah, a longing,
Yeah.
live like a longing. Yeah.
Right. But as long as it cannot be repressed, that longing, and extinguished, there are tendencies, to say, that's stupid, don't, get used to this society. That's the only society you get, Don't think any further, you have to live with that. Then it is extinguished, and it's very sad, when you have students who are 18 years old, and have already a consciousness as if they were 80, and have given up on the world. It's a very sad story. Okay, thank you for coming. You all made history.